September 26, 1945. A newspaper in the USA runs a story with the headline, "Women Prisoners Subjected to Cruel Nazi Experiments." The article talks about how 45 German men were about to stand trial in a British court for crimes they perpetrated at 2 concentration camps, crimes that included hanging women upside down and artificially inseminating them. In what the newspaper called sadistic procedures, many of the women twisted in great pain and soon often died. That's an extremely grim way to open up one of our videos. But if you know anything about Nazi medical experiments, you'll know a great many horrific things happened in those camps. The Nazis weren't conducting these experiments just because they were sadists. Even though many of the people involved may have had sadistic impulses, there was usually a reason for the experiments, such as replicating battlefield injuries, dealing with hypothermia, and testing all manner of medicines and experiments where humans stood in for rabbits. Importantly, where this video today is concerned, the Nazis were obsessed with genes, human reproduction, and the female reproductive organs. The exact number of victims from all Nazi medical experiments is unknown. According to a research paper published by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, there were 15,750 documented victims of Nazi human experimentation. But researchers say the number of victims would have been much higher. It's just that many of the crimes were not documented. The experiment started in 1942, but really picked up speed in 1943, and the horrors didn't stop until the end of the war when the camps were liberated. About 1/4 of the people who were experimented on survived, although often with horrific injuries. Many of them were women, many were Polish, many were Jewish, but many were also Christian of various nationalities, civilian, and sometimes military. Of those who survived, quite a number testified against the Nazi doctors, nurses, and camp supervisors. It's thanks to those testimonies that we can tell you this story today. If you haven't seen any of our other shows on the matter, we'll give you some examples of the experiments. Many German soldiers on the battlefield fighting in the winter months in the frigid towns and fields of the Eastern Front risked dying from hypothermia, so the Nazis conducted freezing experiments on inmates in which they froze people and then tried to heat them up. Not only were these experiments terrifying for the victims, but many of them died. There were between 360 and 400 hypothermia experiments that were conducted on 280 to 300 victims. Then there were the seawater experiments, in which the victims of choice were usually Roma people, an Indo-Aryan ethnic group that reside in Europe. Such people have been oppressed and hounded for centuries, and World War II certainly added to this historical trauma. The Nazis introduced limitations on freedom of movement for Roma and Sinti people, and in 1935, new race laws made them racially alien, denying them rights as the Nazis did with Jewish people. Over 5,000 Roma and Sinti were forced to live in the Lodz Jewish ghetto, from which many were often sent to Auschwitz. In total, 23,000 Sinti and Roma were deported to Auschwitz throughout the entire war, and around 21,000 died, often murdered in the gas chambers. Some were forced to drink seawater. Others took part in the often deadly low-pressure experiments, in which they were subjected to dangerous levels of low pressure, similar to what a Nazi pilot could face. Both these experiments were about replication, trying to see how German soldiers might overcome adversity. One of the most infamous experiments not related to the battlefield became known as the twin experiments. You might have heard the story of the notorious Dr. Josef Mengele and his experiment that involved trying to attach 2 Roma children surgically. The story still stands out as an act of utmost depravity, although it seems Mengele didn't try this often. Still, you can hear testimonies that defy understanding, such as the words of Vera Kriegel, when she said she saw Mengele kill people with an injection through the heart. According to her, Mengele had a thing for eyes. She once said she walked into his laboratory and saw a whole wall of human eyes. In some experiments, he'd inject adrenaline into children's eyes in an attempt to change their eye color. In the years that we've been researching Nazi experiments, we've read about scores of women whose limbs were transplanted, whose tissue was removed in painful surgeries, whose wounds became infected, and in some cases the wounds were purposefully infected so the Nazis could test various drugs on the women. Other experiments included shooting people in the chest or neck after they'd been given a drug that should make the blood coagulate. There was an experiment involving 100 twins in which the kids were given injections of bacteria that caused something called the Noma disease, an infection of the mouth or genitals, which usually causes boils to spring up and can become gangrenous. Mati Alon, who arrived at Auschwitz at age 9 in 1944, said one of the things that forever scarred her memory was seeing an experiment in which Mengele forced a dwarf and a Roma woman to have sex. As we said, the Nazis weren't doing any of this out of some sick perversion. In this last experiment, the purpose was related to breeding. As you know, Nazis were obsessive in their drive to create a pure Aryan race. This is one of the reasons why the Nazis were so heartless when it came to conducting experiments on people they deemed racially impure. They spent a lot of time and effort trying to ensure these supposedly racially impure people could not procreate. In what became known as the sterilization experiments, the Nazis secretly blasted prisoners with powerful X-rays in their genital region. This made them sterile. In theory of what we call eugenics, the Nazis believed they could alter the gene pool, both by trying to wipe out certain genes and promote certain people to procreate. In the early 1900s, many countries, including the US, promoted eugenics, but the Nazis took this to an entirely different level. This video today is mostly related to eugenics, so let's talk some more about that in the wider sense. The Nazis wanted to propagate what they deemed to be pure blood. They went to great lengths to produce a nation of what they believed were Aryan kids, and this is why they introduced something called the Lebensborn program. These were special homes for women who were going to have what the Nazis believed were racially pure children. Women were encouraged to breed with SS men, and if single, they could be cared for at these new homes away from the prying eyes of the public. If a woman could give birth to a lot of so-called pure children, she might even have been awarded the Cross of Honor of the German Mother. The program, led by Heinrich Himmler, wasn't really that successful. Himmler was hoping to fill Germany with blonde-haired, blue-eyed children, or ones that could at least pass as Aryan. But over 9 years of this eugenics project, only around 7,000 children were born into the Lebensborn homes. Himmler was disappointed. The program was close to a failure. He believed that even with Germany's abortion laws, there were still around 100,000 German women who had abortions each year and were going to have racially pure kids. Therefore, he thought if he opened these homes, they could be taken care of and Germany would see an increase in its Aryan population. He wanted them out of the abortion clinic and into the home, where they would be well looked after. These homes, it should be said, were not places where SS men came to impregnate women, by force or as a financial transaction. These pregnancies, according to researchers, usually happened the natural way. Still, Himmler didn't see enough Aryan kids being born, so the Nazis went to some very immoral lengths to make it happen. They kidnapped around 200,000 Polish kids, some of whom were given to German families and handed new identities. They were literally grabbed from the streets and later sent to children's education camps, known as Kindererziehungslager. This also included around 20,000 kids from the Soviet Union and another 10,000 from the rest of Europe. Not all of them were accepted, and the so-called rejects were treated in ways that beggar belief. After the kidnapping, the kids were tested as a means to see their value as potentially good Aryan Germans. Some were chosen, given new names, and taught Nazi values. Those that didn't pass the test were often thrown to the wolves at the concentration camps, where their future, as you already know, was incredibly grim. If the kids were sent to a place called Medizinische Kinderheilanstalt, located in Lubliniec in Upper Silesia, they were often exterminated. Here's an actual snippet from a German report written in this place that was found after the war. The children were administered barbiturate products, mostly luminol in large doses, from 0.1 to 0.6 per day regardless of age. Initially, all the children vomited after they'd been given luminol. Some of them seemed to be adapting. After some time, they got a high fever, stopped eating, and made growling sounds, had foaming mouths, sometimes with blood, and they eventually died. The same thing happened in a place in Szczecin in southern Poland. But this was only for young kids since it was a nursery. There, they were often experimented on. Here's a testimony from a woman named Ruta Hechkuvna. They were beaten, tortured, pinched. During feeding time, they were placed on laps with their head down, their noses were clenched, and a portion of food was poured into their throats while they were being punched in their heads. The children were so scared of the feeding time. If they ended up at Auschwitz, their fate wasn't any better. Their records showed that there was a practice of something called needling, in which children aged 8 to 14 were cruelly killed with a long needle filled with a substance, phenol. This toxic substance was often injected into their necks. Death occurred soon after. Here's an actual report from Auschwitz talking about something that happened during the winter of 1942 and 43. Circa 90 boys were brought by Palich to Block 20, and they were killed there with injections by an NCO paramedic, Sherpa. Sherpa, who later testified in court, was a medical aide. He later said he saw 20 kids receive injections to their hearts. He was asked, "You didn't protest when you saw the children lined up to be given carbolic acid injectors?" "I did, but in the end I just handed the bottle containing the acid to a trusted inmate who had been standing ready with a hypodermic needle." He added, referring to the kids as gypsies, death was always instantaneous. Back to Gerhard Palich. He was one of the absolute worst Nazis at Auschwitz, known for his speech when the prisoners arrived there. Part of it went, "With joy we will hound you all through the chimneys of the crematoria. Forget your wives, your children, your families. "You will die here like dogs." He bragged that he killed around 25,000 people with a gun to the back of the head at what was called the death wall. He was so corrupt that the Nazis moved him to different camps where they hoped he might not cause as much damage and steal so much. He took particular enjoyment in hurting kids. A Polish prisoner at the camp, Witold Pilecki, who wrote down a long list of Nazi atrocities, said about him, "In Block 11, Palich, a particularly dedicated torturer, would hunt children. He told girls to run around a closed yard and would shoot at them, killing them like rabbits. A true degenerate, tears and death followed him. Having committed a most heinous crime, he would come out smiling, handsome and polite, calmly smoking a cigarette." Said by many to be the worst of the worst, Palich never faced trial. He was likely killed in action before the war ended. The Nazis were so wrong-headed, they could capture Polish kids with blonde hair and blue eyes and act surprised that the kids seemed genuinely German. Hans Frank, the general government in Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II, summed that up when he said, "We see a blue-eyed child. We are surprised that he's speaking Polish." Many decades after the war, German men and women were still finding out that they'd been born into one of those homes or were one of the kidnapped kids. Right after the war, teams were sent to Germany to find some of the kidnapped Polish kids, but by that time, they had been brainwashed and others simply didn't seem to realize they'd been kidnapped. Some just said they were not Polish or Ukrainian or Russian, they were German. "So please go away," they pleaded. We think now you have a good idea of how the Nazis tried to create life and how they rubbed it out when they deemed certain people were not racially pure. This brings us to the main topic of the show today, artificial insemination. Let's talk about that newspaper article we talked about in the introduction. Part of it went, "The Nazis practiced artificial insemination of nude women prisoners, hanging helplessly head down. So painful were the experiments that many victims died." The same article said survivors were sometimes given deadly bloodstream injections of gasoline and disinfectants. You already know this was pretty common for kids, but adults often face the fate too. One of the witnesses to these experiments was Helen Hammermash, a woman described by the newspaper as a 25-year-old Polish Jewess and former medical student. She said the women were strung upside down and given something to stimulate their hearts, after which the sperm was introduced. This happened at Oswiecim and Belsen concentration camps, so let's have at 'em. The latter was in northern Germany. When the British liberated it on April 15, 1945, they found around 13,000 bodies scattered around and 60,000 people, most of whom were close to starving and death, seriously ill from disease, or both. As it was often a holding camp for POWs, many of the people who died there were Soviet soldiers, although it was also home to many Jewish people. Two of its most well-known occupants, who both died there, were Margot and Anne Frank. Oswiecim was part of the Auschwitz complex, which consisted of 40 different camps. This was a massive camp where 1.1 million of the 1.3 million sent were exterminated, mostly Jewish people. At the Belsen camp, sometimes called Belsen-Belsen, the Brits could not believe what they were seeing. Rotted bodies laid around the entire camp, some so putrefied they fell apart when the Brits tried to move them. The stench was unbearable. The BBC reported, "Babies had been born here. Tiny wizened things that could not live." A mother, driven mad, screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child and thrust the tiny mite into his arms, then ran off crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found the baby had been dead for days. In 1945, the world heard about the Belsen trials, which was one of the first opportunities for the public to understand the depravity of what happened in those camps. The Brits had arrested a number of Nazis who worked there, from the commandant Joseph Kramer to the camp doctor Fritz Klein to the head warden Elisabeth Vulkenrath. Prior to the British and also Canadian soldiers entering the camp, the Nazis had agreed to a truce so there would be no more fighting. This meant the swift arrest of those who worked there, men and women who had to help with the cleanup. Around 500 people had been dying each day from typhus. It really was a sight you could call hell on earth, although not every prisoner was in such bad condition. Some prisoners had arrived earlier from another camp, and they looked a lot better. Those men, once Belsen was liberated, turned on the Germans and foreign capos, or prisoners forced to work for the Nazis, and murdered around 170 of them. But the ones that survived that ordeal faced trial. This included 12 capos, 16 female SS members, and 16 male SS members. 3 SS members had been shot trying to escape, while 17 SS members were already dead from typhus before the trial began. Many of the transcripts, and there are a lot of them, show how people, sometimes Polish, became capos and were accused of cruelty to other prisoners. One Polish capo got 15 years in prison after being accused of beating a sick French prisoner to death by hitting him over the head with an iron soup ladle. As much as we'd like to tell you about those transcripts, we'd be here until next week doing it, so now let's focus on artificial insemination again. While sterilization was the norm at many camps, the main artificial insemination testimony came from the woman we just mentioned, Helen Hammermasch, who you know was a student of medicine. She'd run away to Hungary when the Nazis entered Poland, but was sent back and handed over to the Gestapo. In her testimony, she talked about the train journey to the camp, saying, "There was a selection immediately after we got out of the train, and some people were sent by vehicles to the crematorium, I being one of the few to be sent to the camp." She said they were lined up and chosen in a selection process and beaten if they cried. Dr. Kramer and Dr. Klein performed the selection. Klein once said, "My Hippocratic oath tells me to cut a gangrenous appendix out of the human body. The Jews are the gangrenous appendix of mankind. That's why I cut them out." Klein and Kramer weren't the only problem. These people who ran the camp were just as bad, according to Helen. Of her work in the leather factory, she said, "They treated us very badly there. We had 2 overseers called Fohr and Otto Graf. Graf beat us every day, and once a girl called Maria Dombrowska was so severely beaten that she was taken away dead. He kicked her and beat her with a rubber truncheon." She said Graf once beat a French girl in the factory and let her lie on the floor next to the workers. She lay there all day in pain and died in the evening. Helen said that Graf worked half the time in the crematorium. She explained he enjoyed telling the women in the factory about how much better female bodies burned than male bodies. He was an out-and-out sicko. Since Helen was a medical student, she got to work in the hospital, and that's where she saw people dying after being injected with petrol and Lysol. Her testimony is astonishingly vivid. She talks of women being beaten, of men being beaten, including a Russian man kicked to death by Dr. Kramer, but her words about artificial insemination are actually about something she was told. The American newspaper got that part wrong. In her actual testimony, she said, "I was told by one of my friends who worked as a nurse in the hospital that in Block 10 of Auschwitz, there were young women on whom experiments were made with artificial insemination. The victim was hung up by her legs and was injected in order that her blood might circulate freely. She then received an injection in which sperm was introduced. After a short time, the victim was in great pain and quite often, not long after, died." Also in the Belsen trials, a woman named Ada Bimko testified. She described herself as a Jewess from Poland and a doctor of medicine. Thousands of people were taken from her town in Poland. The day she was pushed onto a train, many were sent loaded onto trucks for the crematorium. She said in court, "My father, mother, brother, husband, and small son of 6 years of age were included in that number." It's hard to imagine what that would feel like, but at the camp she experienced another hell, where the goal of every day was just to survive. One day she met a woman who was talking about ending it all. She asked the woman what happened, and the woman told her the Nazi doctors had just tried to artificially inseminate her. She said she was worried that they had rendered her physically incapable of bearing children. There isn't too much other evidence in the Belsen trial testimonies that we can find regarding artificial insemination. Truth be known, so often the women were tampered with and had no idea what the doctors were doing to them. At Auschwitz, these experiments on women's reproductive organs usually happened in Block 10. One of the main experimenters was the gynecologist Karl Klauberg, who was highly regarded for his work on female fertility hormones. He was known to sterilize women, sometimes by injecting caustic substances into their uteruses. A report stated these procedures sometimes led to peritonitis and hemorrhages from the reproductive tract, leading to high fever and sepsis. One of the women in Block 10, Dr. Dorota Lorska, later talked about her experience, calling the block a mix of hell and a madhouse. She said Klauberg caused sterilization by irradiation. He often injected the women with something, but she didn't know what. She did know that sometimes he removed the women's ovaries. In her notes, she wrote, "I cannot say what he plans to do with them in the future. He performs all the procedures personally with the help of untrained staff who do not understand what he is doing." In another passage, she wrote, "There was no doubt that this gynecologist, so very well known in the academic world, was devising artificial insemination experiments." We should add here that the first successful birth of a child born through artificial insemination didn't happen until 1978, but the first animal to give birth that way, a rabbit, was in 1939. Perhaps the Nazis thought they could pioneer this procedure. We can find no evidence that explains why they were performing these experiments, as all records have been destroyed. It's well known, though, that all over the world, scientists in the 30s and 40s talked about the possibility of artificial insemination. The British wondered if they could repopulate their country with it. The New York City gynecologist, Dr. Francis Seymour, talked about the wonder of eugenic babies. It's hardly surprising that the Nazis would try to make it a reality. Klauberg spent just 7 years in prison after the war, but after being released was captured again after an uproar, and he died before his next sentence. Mengele escaped to South America and died there in 1979, age 67. One question you might have is, where did the sperm come from for those experiments? Here's a testimony of a man who said the Nazi doctor shoved something up his backside to make him ejaculate. He said, "He then turned the stick and caused an involuntary ejaculation of sperm." A female SS officer who worked with the other officer held 2 pieces of glass underneath my genitals in order to collect a sample of my sperm for the lab. They then made me stand up on a special machine that gave electric waves to both sides of my genitals again until sperm was ejaculated. Both Dr. Klein and Dr. Kramer were hanged by the British, as were 6 other men in the Belsen trials. 3 women were sent to the gallows too. One was the guard Irma Gressa, the so-called hyena of Auschwitz, said to be a very feared woman in the camp due to her sadistic proclivities. 18 other people were also sentenced to 1 to 15 years. Now you need to watch how they finally caught the Nazi butcher, or have a look at real reason why Nazi officers fled to Argentina after World War II.